My best friend admitted he slept with my wife at a party in my own house. I learned a long time ago that money does not buy peace. It just buys quieter rooms to hear your own thoughts. That night my house was full of people, and yet I felt alone. It was one of those parties that looks effortless, but is actually planned like a product launch. Warm lights, soft music, trays that never emptied, laughter in all the right places. I hosted it because it was good for business, and because my wife Lena liked the idea of us being that couple, the successful husband with the company he built from nothing and the elegant wife who made everything look tasteful without looking like she tried. I had learned to play my role well, smile, shake hands, remember names, promise calls I would actually make, and all evening Lena moved through the rooms like she owned the air, touching shoulders, laughing at jokes before they even finished, checking on me with quick glances that felt like little kisses from across the crowd. If you asked me that day if I trusted her, I would have said yes without blinking, not because I was naive, but because I believed in evidence, numbers, results, contracts, and Lena had never given me a number that did not add up. At least that is what I told myself. My friend Mark arrived late, which was normal for him. He always acted like the world was lucky he showed up at all. Mark was the kind of guy who could make a room laugh and then make one person feel like the joke was actually about them. I had known him since college. We built our adult lives side by side. He did marketing and networking. I built the business. We were not partners on paper, but he was part of my rise. And that history makes you blind in a very specific way, because you do not want to admit that someone who clapped for you in the beginning might be clapping for the wrong reasons. He walked in with that easy grin and a bottle that was too expensive to be casual. He hugged Lena first, longer than I noticed at the time. Then he clasped my shoulder and said, "The house looks like a magazine." I joked that I was waiting for the issue where they reveal it is all rented. He laughed too loud, and then his eyes did something odd. They skipped away from mine like they were avoiding a spotlight. I dismissed it. I have seen people act weird at parties for 100 reasons. Too much caffeine, too much ambition, too much guilt. Guilt was not a word I would have used then. Not for Mark, not for Lena. The night rolled forward on the polished wheels of small talk. Investors asked about next quarter. Someone wanted advice about hiring. Someone else wanted to take a picture near the fireplace because apparently my fireplace had become a local landmark. Lena drifted in and out of conversations, always nearby, but never stuck, like she was managing the whole room. And maybe she was. Every time I turned my head, she was there, smiling, glowing. The kind of presence that makes you feel lucky, the kind of presence you assume is on your side. Mark stayed close too, which should have felt normal, but it did not. He was not chatting with my guests the way he usually did. He kept hovering near the hallway, near the quieter rooms, near the places where people go when they want a private conversation. I caught him watching Lena when he thought nobody was looking, just a quick look, like a check-in, like a signal. And my brain still refused to connect the dots because my brain was trained to protect the picture of my life that I had spent years building. Later, when people talk about denial, they make it sound dramatic, like a screaming refusal, but denial is actually polite. It smiles, it nods, it keeps holding your drink and asking about the weather. Around 10:30, I stepped into my office to grab a folder I needed for a client who would not stop talking about a contract he wanted signed. My office was quiet. The door almost closed by itself behind me, and for a moment I heard the party as if it was happening in another house. Then I heard footsteps in the hall, slow, hesitant, the kind of footsteps that do not want to arrive. The door cracked open, and Mark slid inside like he was sneaking into his own life. He did not smile this time. He looked pale under the warm light. I remember thinking he looked like a guy who just realized the elevator is stuck between floors. He said my name, just once, and it sounded heavy. I said, "What is it? Business? Personal? Or are you about to ask me to hide a body?" I was trying to lighten it, make it normal. Mark did not laugh. He stared at the floor like the carpet had answers. Then he looked up and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it now." And the air in my office changed, the way it changes before a storm when the world holds its breath. I put the folder down. I leaned against the edge of my desk, and I said, "Okay, talk." Mark swallowed. His throat moved like he was forcing down rocks. And he said, "It is about Lena, and about me." And before he finished the sentence, I felt a strange calm, not peace. More like my brain pulling a glass cover down over my emotions so I could watch what came next without being burned. Mark said, "I am not proud of it. I have been carrying it. I cannot carry it anymore. And I think you deserve the truth." I stared at him and I waited. Because when you run a company, you learn that silence makes people fill the space with what they're trying to hide. Mark exhaled, and he said, "Lena and I," and he stopped. And in that stop, I saw my whole life sitting on a shelf, balanced, fragile. And I thought, no, not my wife, not my friend, not in my house, not in my story. I forced a small laugh and said you were drunk. Mark shook his head, and his eyes got wet. And he said, I wish I was. I wish I could take it back. It happened. More than once. And as he said it, I heard a burst of laughter from the party outside, bright and careless, like the universe was mocking me with background noise. I felt my jaw tighten. I said you were lying. Mark flinched like I slapped him with the word. He said, I am telling you because I cannot stand it, because you are good to her and good to me, and I broke something that was not mine. I stared at him, and I said, prove it, because my mind was still refusing to accept something that did not fit the data. Mark wiped his face with his hand like a tired kid, and he said, I can tell you where, I can tell you when, I can tell you what she said, and I can show you messages. And the way he said messages made my stomach drop, because lies can be improvised, but messages leave tracks. I took a breath and I asked, where? And Mark answered quietly, not here, not tonight. But it started after your last business trip, the one to Chicago, and the room seemed to tilt just a little, because I remembered that trip. I remembered calling Lena from the hotel and hearing music in the background. She said she was at home, just cleaning, just relaxing, and now that memory felt like a photograph that had been edited. I asked Mark to repeat himself, and he did. Chicago, he said, and then he added, and there is more. And I realized this was not going to be a single confession. It was going to be a slow reveal, the kind that changes everything piece by piece. I glanced at the door, at the noise beyond it, at my guests smiling in my house, and I said, not here, not now. And Mark said, please, you asked for the truth, and I said, you are right. I did. I stepped closer, lowered my voice, and said, tell me everything you think you know. And do not spare me, because sparing me would be another lie. Mark nodded, his hands shaking, and he reached into his pocket. And I saw the corner of his phone, and I understood that the proof was real, and the night that had started like a celebration had just turned into a courtroom, and I was the judge and the defendant at the same time. And in the next room, my wife laughed at something someone said, and I wondered if she could feel the floor shifting under her too, or if she was still dancing on a lie that had not cracked yet. And I realized something else. If Mark was confessing now at my party in my house, then the truth was already bigger than the two of them. It had weight, it had history, it had details, and I was about to hear them all, whether I wanted to or not. I told Mark to sit down, and he did not argue. He dropped into the chair like his legs had finally given up pretending. I stayed standing because sitting felt too much like surrender. I asked him to start from the beginning, not the emotional beginning, the factual one, dates, places, words, because facts were the only thing keeping my hands steady. Mark nodded and spoke slowly like each sentence cost him interest. He said it started after that Chicago trip, exactly like he had said before. Lena had called him first, not the other way around. She said she felt invisible, that I was always working, that success had turned me into a ghost who only appeared at dinner and disappeared behind emails. Hearing that stung, but it did not break me. I knew I worked a lot, and I also knew I worked for us. Mark said he listened, that he thought he was being a friend. I almost laughed at that. Then he said one conversation turned into many. Many turned into meetings. Meetings turned into lines being crossed. I stopped him there and asked where. He hesitated and said places that felt safe. Hotels on the edge of town. His apartment once when I was at a conference. Every word landed like a small controlled explosion. No fire, just pressure. I asked him how long. He said months, not weeks, months. And that word finally made my chest tighten, because months means planning. It means repetition. It means choices made over and over again. I asked him if Lena ever talked about me. He said yes, and then corrected himself and said not badly, more like sadly, like she was telling a story where she was the main character and I was a supporting role who forgot his lines. I thanked him for that honesty because at least it was consistent with the woman I thought I knew. Mark pulled out his phone and held it out to me like an offering. I did not take it right away. I asked him one more thing. Why? Now. Why tonight? Why in my house with people laughing 10 feet away? He looked up at me and said, because she was going to tell you something else, and I could not let you hear a half-truth first. That sentence chilled me more than everything else. I took the phone, my hands steady in a way that surprised me. I scrolled through messages, nothing explicit, nothing that would get flagged in any algorithm, but everything was worse because of that. Inside jokes, plans, apologies, comfort, the kind of emotional intimacy that leaves fingerprints all over your life. There was no doubt, no room to negotiate reality. I handed the phone back and said thank you for telling me. Mark started crying then, quietly, like he did not want the house to hear him. He said he was sorry. He said he would do anything to fix it. I told him some things cannot be fixed, They can only be survived. I asked him to leave my office and my house. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just leave. He nodded and stood, paused at the door and said, Lena does not know I told you. I said she will. He left, and for a moment I stood alone listening to my own breathing. I checked my reflection in the dark window. My face looked calm, older somehow, but calm. Then I opened the door and walked back into the party. Lena saw me immediately. Her smile flashed like a reflex. She came toward me and asked if everything was okay. I said yes, because the word still worked in public. She touched my arm and said Mark looked upset. I said he had to leave. She searched my face. Something flickered. Concern, maybe fear. She asked if we should talk later. I said yes later. And that later suddenly felt like a countdown. The rest of the night passed in a blur of polite endings. Guests leaving, compliments about the house, promises to follow up. Lena stayed close. Too close. Like proximity could stitch something together. When the last door closed and the silence settled, she turned to me and said, okay, tell me. And I looked at her and realized this was the moment where anger would have been easy and loud and satisfying. But control felt better, heavier but better. I said Mark told me everything, and the color drained from her face. She tried to speak and stopped, then said he had no right. I said he had every right. She said it was complicated. I said it was not. She said she loved me. I said love does not look like this. She reached for my hands and I stepped back, not because I hated her, but because I needed space to think. She started crying, saying she was lonely, that she felt abandoned, that she never meant to hurt me. I listened, really listened, because I wanted to be sure, and when she finished I said we will talk about logistics tomorrow. Tonight I am sleeping in the guest room. She said no, please do not do this. I said I am not doing anything. I am pausing. And sometimes a pause is the most honest thing you can give someone. I walked away and closed the door gently, and behind it I heard her sob, and I stood there for a second letting the sound pass through me. Then I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling, knowing my life had just split into before and after, and that tomorrow the real decisions would begin. I did not sleep that night, not because my mind was racing, but because it was too quiet, like a system rebooting in silence. Morning came without drama, sunlight through the guest room curtains, birds doing their job without caring about my personal crisis. I got up early and went for a run, because movement has always been how I think. Every step on the pavement felt like I was outrunning a version of myself that wanted to scream. When I came back, Lena was at the kitchen table, eyes swollen, hands wrapped around a cold mug. She looked smaller somehow, like the house had expanded overnight and left her behind. She asked if we could talk. I said we already were, just without words. She tried to explain again, adding details like they could soften the outline. She said it never meant to become serious. I said it became serious the second it became a secret. She asked if we could go to counseling, take a break, reset. I said trust does not reset like a password. It either exists or it does not. She said she would do anything, quit her job, cut people out, prove herself. I said proving something after it breaks is like gluing glass. It might hold, but you will always see the cracks. She accused me then, softly, of choosing pride over family. I smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. I told her this was not pride, it was clarity. I said we would divorce, calmly, legally, with dignity. She cried harder, said I was throwing everything away. I said no, I am keeping what is mine, my sanity, my work, my future. That afternoon I called my lawyer, not in anger, but like I schedule any important meeting, precise and prepared. I also called my assistant and cleared my week, because I knew distraction would be my enemy. Lena followed me from room to room, trying to rewrite history in real time, pointing to memories, trips, photos on the wall, asking how I could erase all of it. I said memories are not erased, they are reclassified. She asked about the business, worried suddenly about numbers and shares she had never cared about before. I told her calmly that the company was protected, built before the marriage, structured carefully. She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. I was seeing one too. That night she tried one last time, standing in the doorway, saying she loved me, that we could still be happy. I looked at her and said happiness built on betrayal is just comfort wearing a disguise. She left the room without another word, and in that silence I felt something unexpected. Relief, not joy, not victory, but the relief of no longer pretending, and I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it standing upright, not clinging to a story that had already ended. The days that followed moved slowly and quickly at the same time, slow in the quiet moments and fast in the decisions. The divorce process began like a machine switching on, Paperwork timelines, polite emails that said everything. Without emotion, Lena shifted between regret and resistance. Some days she was apologetic and gentle, other days sharp and accusing, saying I was cold, saying I was punishing her. I let the words pass through me without settling, because I had learned that reacting would only keep me tied to the chaos. I focused on my company, on meetings that reminded me who I was outside of marriage, employees who depended on my clarity, projects that needed direction. Work grounded me, not as an escape, but as a mirror. It showed me that I was still capable, still respected, still moving forward. Mark tried to reach out once, a long message about accountability and remorse. I did not reply. Some conversations end even if the other person is still talking. Lena suggested mediation, dinners, long talks late at night. I declined politely, not cruelly. I said my decision was not a phase, it was a conclusion. She asked how I could be so calm. I told her calm comes after truth, not before it. Friends chose sides quietly. Some avoided me, some admired the way I handled it. I did not correct anyone. Everyone sees what they are ready to see. The house felt different, bigger, emptier, but also honest. One evening I took down a framed photo of our wedding. Not angrily, just thoughtfully. I wrapped it in paper and placed it in a box labeled past. Not trash, just past. And in doing that I felt something settle inside me. The understanding that endings do not have to be explosive to be final. Lena moved out a week later. She cried when she closed the door. I did not follow her, not because I did not care, but because caring does not always mean chasing. That night I sat alone on the couch and realized I was not afraid of the future anymore. The hardest part had already happened. The truth had arrived, and I had survived it, with my dignity intact and my direction clear. After Lena moved out, the world did not collapse like people expect it to. It simply rearranged itself. Mornings became quieter, routines sharper. I cooked for myself and realized I was better at it than I remembered. Workdays stretched but felt cleaner. Without the low background tension I had mistaken for normal marriage stress. The divorce negotiations continued with a strange professionalism. Numbers discussed without raised voices. Assets divided like items on a spreadsheet. Lena tried again to appeal not to love, but to nostalgia, reminding me of how we started, the tiny apartment, the late nights when I was building the company, and she believed in me before anyone else did. I acknowledged that truth without letting it change the outcome. Gratitude does not require continuation. During this time, I learned how many people confuse forgiveness with access. I forgave her quietly in my own head, not for her sake, but for mine, but access was gone, permanently. One afternoon, I ran into an old colleague who asked how I was holding up. I said better than expected, and realized it was true. Pain had been replaced by focus, and focus by momentum. The business hit a milestone that month, one I had been chasing for years, and when the numbers came in I smiled. Not because of revenge or validation, but because my life was still expanding, not shrinking. Lena noticed the change too. She asked if I was seeing someone else. The question carried fear. I said no. I am seeing myself clearly for the first time in a while. She did not know what to do with that answer. The divorce finalized without drama. Signatures on clean pages, no courtroom scenes, no shouting. Just an ending agreed upon by two people who now wanted different futures. When it was over, I went for a long drive alone, windows down, no destination, thinking about how betrayal teaches you something strange, not about others, but about your own strength. I realized I had not lost my friend and my wife in the same moment. I had lost illusions, and illusions are heavy things to carry. Letting them go felt like putting down a bag I had been hauling for years without realizing it. That night, I stood on my balcony looking at the city lights and felt something solid inside me. Not happiness exactly, but confidence, the kind that does not need witnesses. I knew then that the story was not about what was taken from me. It was about what I refused to give up, my self-respect, my clarity, my future, and that realization changed everything. Time kept moving, and I moved with it instead of fighting the current. The silence in my house became familiar rather than loud. Friends started inviting me out again, not out of pity but curiosity, like they were meeting a new version of me. I let some people back in and kept others at a distance, not out of bitterness but out of precision. I had learned the cost of letting everyone have access. Mark disappeared from my orbit completely. No dramatic confrontation, no closure speech, just absence, and that absence felt appropriate. I did not need an apology tour or an explanation sequel. Some chapters end without a summary. Lena sent a few messages over the months, updates disguised as concern, questions disguised as nostalgia. I responded kindly and briefly, Kindness without hope is a powerful boundary. She once asked if I ever missed us. I told her I missed who I thought we were, not who we turned out to be. That answer ended the conversation in a way shouting never could. My business continued to grow, and with it my confidence. Not the loud kind that shows up early, but the quiet kind that stays late. I started mentoring younger founders, not because I wanted to teach success, but because I wanted to teach resilience. How to keep your spine straight when life tries to bend it. One evening after a long day, I realized something important. I no longer replayed the betrayal in my head. Not the party, not the messages, not the lies. The memory had lost its charge. It was just information now, filed and closed. I laughed out loud at that realization. Because freedom does not always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly while you are doing the dishes. I understood then that I had won something more valuable than an argument or a settlement. I had won myself back, and no one could take that from me again. Time kept moving, and I moved with it instead of fighting the current. The silence in my house became familiar rather than loud. Friends started inviting me out again, not out of pity but curiosity, like they were meeting a new version of me. I let some people back in and kept others at a distance, not out of bitterness but out of precision. I had learned the cost of letting everyone have access. Mark disappeared from my orbit completely. No dramatic confrontation, no closure speech, just absence. And that absence felt appropriate. I did not need an apology tour or an explanation sequel. Some chapters end without a summary. Lena sent a few messages over the months. Updates disguised as concern, questions disguised as nostalgia. I responded kindly and briefly. Kindness without hope is a powerful boundary. She once asked if I ever missed us. I told her I missed who I thought we were, not who we turned out to be. That answer ended the conversation in a way shouting never could. My business continued to grow, and with it my confidence. Not the loud kind that shows up early, but the quiet kind that stays late. I started mentoring younger founders, not because I wanted to teach success, but because I wanted to teach resilience. How to keep your spine straight when life tries to bend it. One evening after a long day I realized something important. I no longer replayed the betrayal in my head. Not the party, not the messages, not the lies. The memory had lost its charge. It was just information now, filed and closed. I laughed out loud at that realization. Because freedom does not always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly while you are doing the dishes. I understood then that I had won something more valuable than an argument or a settlement. I had won myself back, and no one could take that from me. Again, the final lesson arrived without ceremony on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting in my office reviewing projections when I caught my reflection in the glass wall. Relaxed posture, clear eyes, steady hands. And I realized this was the version of me that had been waiting patiently through every compromise I ever made. I thought about that night of the party, the laughter, the lights, the lie hiding in plain sight. And instead of anger, I felt gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, but for the way it forced honesty into my life. Because comfort can be dangerous when it keeps you asleep. Lena eventually stopped writing. Not because she stopped feeling, but because she finally understood I was no longer available to the past. Mark became a story I rarely told. Not out of pain, but irrelevance. People sometimes ask me if I would do anything differently. If I would watch closer, trust less, love slower. I tell them no, I would do it the same. Because the goal is not to avoid being hurt. The goal is to remain yourself when it happens. I did not win because I kept the house or the business or my reputation. I won because I did not let betrayal turn me into something smaller. I stayed calm, I stayed fair, I stayed upright. And that quiet strength carried me forward. Today my life is not louder or flashier. It is cleaner, built on truth rather than assumption. I wake up knowing that whatever comes next will meet a man who knows his worth and does not negotiate it. And if there is one thing this story taught me, it is this. Losing people who choose lies over you is not a loss. It is a release. And walking away with your dignity intact is the kind of victory that never needs applause.